good evening to you both. And let's begin with Preston Manning weighing in on the issue of unity by pressing for the election of a new government.
That doesn't have a track record of supporting climate change, that doesn't have a track record of crippling the resource sectors, that fresh new administration will be much stronger in negotiating with Trump and the Americans than a Liberal administration that has all that baggage.
And following up on a recent op-ed in the Globe and Mail, the former opposition leader says he's not advocating for secession, but if the Liberals win, sentiments for such will spike, producing a unity crisis on both the Western Front and in Quebec. Manning is calling for a post-election Democratic forum to discuss independence and related issues, regardless of who wins. Laurie, to what degree is the separatist movement in Alberta more organized, more vocal this time around?
Well, it may well be more vocal, but I mean, it still represents a very small proportion. I mean, we look at the most recent polling, there's less support for any kind of independence in Alberta than there is in Quebec. It's absolutely clear that there are a lot of Albertans that feel like they are not being fairly represented or treated, and that needs to be considered seriously in whatever happens in the future. But it's very important to understand that some of the folks that are, the polling shows, as far as joining the United States, that the support for that drops it way down to like 10% in the polls that I've seen. And there are a lot of Albertans that are worried about this. It isn't particularly helping Alberta in the national conversation. I have never seen Quebec say, vote this way or we're out. This is not, quite often people talk about Quebec being the example of what Alberta can do in terms of advancing its interest in the Federation. Never seen anything like this coming out of Quebec. And bottom line, I'm assuming that Preston Manning is hoping to sway the election and votes across the country. And it's probably going to have the opposite effect to what he's hoping.
Matt, how much sway do you see this movement carrying if it is that the Conservatives are not elected to government on Monday?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to pick up on what Laurie was saying, there's two ways I think you can break this down or analyze it, right? So will Preston Manning have his desired effect? Is this a real serious movement? And, probably not. It's, it remains a small subset, but I think it would be wrong to not treat Preston Manning as a very serious political commentator and analyst in his own right, and so if we look at his rise, leader of the Reform Party, that eventually merged with the Progressive Conservatives, that changed the face of how the Conservative Party in Canada operated, right? And you look at some of the recent election battles, Peter MacKay, Jean Charest, they were not elected. They would be kind of considered old PC members, and they were not elected to lead the current iteration of the Conservative Party of Canada. And so, Preston Manning, he certainly has his pulse on something, right? And it might not necessarily be the opinion of the vast majority of Canadians, but he certainly is able to tap into something. And so I think it's his voice is to be taken seriously.
Laurie, what's to be made at this point of Preston Manning's call for what he terms a Democratic forum, something to discuss the secession sentiment, a platform to provide debate on options?
Well, it's something that he wants to see happen. We've heard Danielle Smith's sort of views about something like a fair deal panel again after the next election. In her case, particularly if the Liberals win. I will say this: there are, and I mentioned it earlier, there are genuine concerns that this is tapping into. There are a lot of Albertans who have no interest in independence or separation, but do have an interest in having their voices heard in the Federation and of receiving sort of fair treatment. Some policies really do not line up with that, and this is going to be a challenge. If Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre win, they're going to have to try to deal with some of these concerns that have been coming out of Alberta. They didn't go away under Stephen Harper. The reality is that it's a big country, it's diverse, there are regional differences, substantial regional differences that exist, and it's difficult to represent all of them. But we have an opportunity right now in Canada with this surge in national unity, this willingness to work together for the interests of Canada as a whole. And I think there's an opportunity that I would hope neither of those leaders, whichever becomes the next prime minister, would squander.
All right, to shift the focus a little bit, the federal election also definitely on the radar of young voters.
For me, it's fighting against Donald Trump and like the tariffs. I think that's like the biggest issue.
I feel like the healthcare system.
Lower tuition, like less extra costs.
Affordability, it's like really hard to purchase a house.
Cost of living is the top issue of 18 to 34-year-olds surveyed by Nanos Research, with jobs and the economy next, followed by housing. And when asked who will best help young Canadians, 38% said Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, with that number highest among men at nearly 39%, roughly 25% for women. Matt, how much of a difference do you see between the perspectives of young voters and their older counterparts, and what that might say about impact on the election?
Well, it's not older counterparts writ large, right? It's the next cohort up, kind of like the 35 to 50-year-olds, which in the a shocking turn of events now seem to be more aligned with more progressive parties than young voters. It's part of a worldwide shift where there has been a lot of interest in populist movements and parties. There was a really interesting interview that Pete Buttigieg, who is was a former Democratic presidential candidate. He went on a right-wing podcast in America, right, and was speaking in a very plain and serious way with this right-wing podcaster. And I think what was interesting that came out of that is the podcaster kind of was putting it to him of like, well, maybe the Democratic Party has a lot to offer, but the Conservative Party, or the Republicans, when I hear them speak, they touch me in my soul, like kind of like at an emotional level, right? And so certainly progressive parties, I think, have some work to do in terms of how they're able to connect with people and the very real issues that are facing them, and these polls seem to suggest that this is something that progressive parties really have to work on.
Laurie, how do you see party leadership weighing against party policy where young voters are concerned?
Well, I think generally speaking, if we look at the polling overall, the policy doesn't seem to be the big focus in this election. And part of that is because the policies are quite similar on a lot of issues. And of course, depending on which of those issues matters more to you, that might shift your vote one direction or the other. The focus is much more on leaders in this election. And because of that focus on leaders, and just generally speaking, the polling being better for Mark Carney amongst young women, and better for older voters, male and female, that leadership question, not just the vision for the future, but the ability to achieve that vision for the future, that seems to be what's animating a number of voters across the country. And we're even seeing a bit of a split amongst those young voters in terms of who has the best vision and the best capacity to achieve it. But again, this may become and it will actually become a much bigger challenge after the election as we get down to trying to deal with the very, very difficult issues that Canada is looking at.
With the passing of the Pope, Francis is being remembered as the first to apologize to Canada's Indigenous community for the horrors of the residential school system.
It was a very powerful, special moment for Indigenous peoples because the head of the church came, and he didn't have to come.
The apology came during Pope Francis's visit to Alberta in 2022. His funeral will be held Saturday at the Vatican, and Governor General Mary Simon will be there to represent Canada. Matt, that visit to Musqueam nearly 3 years ago, apologizing for the church's role in residential schools. How do you see that factoring into the legacy of Pope Francis?
Yeah, it certainly is part of his legacy as, what will, at least for the short term, go down as the most progressive pope of all time, right? And so, I think Perry Bellegarde is right, the former national chief of the AFN, that Pope Francis didn't have to come, but I think it was part of a broader his broader orientation to the world, right? Of seeing the Catholic Church in a global sense. And we have to remember, this is a very old institution, at least 1700 years old according to legal scholars, but going back 2,000 years, right? If you take it back the full way, and so that history is really based in the Mediterranean, right? And in Europe, and popes have typically come from that region. And if the Pope had been, somebody who grew up in Italy, was, based in that Mediterranean culture, I'm not sure they would have taken the time to really have this high up on their agenda. But certainly Pope Francis, although he has a mixed record on progressive issues, his attentiveness to the harms of colonization was something that he seemed quite serious about.
Laurie, his approach to the papacy, how progressive do you feel a leader Pope Francis was, especially where it concerns Indigenous relations?
It's a bit mixed. There are some people who thought that his apology didn't go far enough. I mean, certainly on the inclusion of women, people thought that was a file that just wasn't, not enough progress was made on that. But in terms of opening the church, being a lot less judgmental than leaders of the church have been in the past, more committed to a humble sort of servant role. Even his speech on the priorities we ought to have during the pandemic, I think it was an outreach that connected to people and to their spirituality in a way that I certainly haven't seen before. There's a willingness to acknowledge mistakes on all kinds of files, certainly on Indigenous issues, but also his apology for his own behavior in not earlier recognizing the wrongs of a Chilean bishop who had defended a particularly bad pedophile perpetrator within the church. And I think in those ways, progress has been made, and it's laid a foundation, I think, that many people are hoping will be built on, to connect that outreach even to, as we're seeing amongst those who are in Rome mourning his passing, who aren't even believers, much less Catholics. It seems to have made a connection to people more broadly.
Matt, given we're in the home stretch of the federal election, what do you make of Governor General Mary Simon representing Canada at the Pope's funeral Saturday, heading a Canadian delegation?
I think it's fitting, right? Mary Simon is herself, historic in the role, being the first Indigenous person in that role as Governor General. And yeah, just to echo what Laurie said, like it's not a perfect record that Pope Francis had, but this is the culmination of decades of work on the part of Indigenous peoples. Starting with individual lawsuits against the federal government and against the churches for abuse experienced at residential schools, which became a class action suit. That class action suit funded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which made the recommendation. And although it looked like that recommendation was going to be ignored, after the Kamloops, the findings of the unmarked graves at the Kamloops residential school, you had an increased attention. And then the Indigenous delegation went to Rome. And for me, what was really touching that came out of that is, there was a woman as part of that Indigenous delegation who went to Rome in March 2022, who gave Pope Francis a set of moccasins and said, when you come to Canada, you can give these back to me. These moccasins represent, all the children who are lost at residential schools. And he held on to those moccasins and gave them back. And she calls them sacred moccasins, right? And I think that there's something, a really powerful spiritual symbolism in thinking about these sacred children's moccasins that I hope stays with us.
Very moving. All right, let's squeeze in one more topic. We heard from Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, Doug Griffiths off the top, on Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick inking an agreement to remove trade barriers between their provinces. Laurie, how much motivation do you see this deal being for other provinces to get on the bandwagon, start showing some actions?
Yeah, I mean, and there is movement being made. So we're seeing two more provinces taking initiatives on this currently, two from the Maritimes involving Ontario. Shows a bit of leadership on the part of now 4 premiers on making specific changes in response to the challenge. And of course, there's a great opportunity here in that there's been a surge of national unity, of pride in Canada, a desire to increase our independence and our support of other Canadians. Great opportunities there. So we're seeing the Prime Minister currently, and I expect after the election that will continue, building on existing policies. There is a Canadian free trade agreement that all provinces have signed on to, but there's still the possibility of opting out on particular matters. That's something that's being looked at carefully. There, as Doug Griffiths mentions, the New West trade partnership that it's involved the prairie provinces and BC. That's something that can be built on. In fact, up until this point, that has been sort of the leading agreement, the most successful agreement amongst provinces to reduce trade barriers. So I think there's a lot of good foundational work that exists. Much more needs to be done, and it's going to be tough because it could cost provinces and some of the people within those provinces, and that's where the federal government could come in with respect to compensation. So I think opportunities exist here. There's a will, a spirit of community here that we can build on.
All right. I'm afraid to say, Matt, we're out of time, so we'll have to catch up with you on that one next time. Good to see you both. Thank you kindly for this.
Okay, thanks,
Michael.